Hi Year 11s, this is the lecture on the digestive system that I started last week and will continue with this week. You can rewatch all of it during the week and complete the work booklet. We've got a few disruptions this week with the teacher strike on Tuesday, Anzac Day on Thursday and Sports Day on Friday. Much of the information from the lecture can be found in Chapter 6 in your Human Perspectives book between pages 141 and 167. So the presentation describes the digestive system, but just to point out that the digestion is necessary to break down the complex nutrients that we get from our diet into simpler compounds that can then be absorbed into the body. The digestive processes are broadly split into two, which are either chemical or mechanical. So mechanical processes are physical, so physically breaking down the food into smaller particles, and the chemical digestion is where the compounds are broken into smaller molecules. So the digestive system is the system in the body that breaks down the food, which is then taken into the body for absorption into the cells. The digestive system includes the alimentary canal and also the accessory organs like the pancreas, the liver and the gallbladder. I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But the alimentary canal is like a continuous tube that runs from the mouth to the anus. The lining of that tube is the surface through which all the nutrients are absorbed. There is a distinction between digestion, which is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food, and absorption, which is the process of absorbing the substances into the cells or across the tissues and organs through diffusion or osmosis. The alimentary canal and accessory organs of the digestive system carry out the following 6 basic activities: ingestion, so getting the food in; mechanical, so physical breakdown of the food; chemical digestion, and movement of the food along the alimentary canal, followed by the absorption of the digested food and water into the blood and the lymph systems, and finishing with the elimination of materials that are not absorbed or used. This diagram shows you a cross-section through the head, showing you some of the digestive organs as a side view. We'll go through each one in turn. So in the mouth there's both mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion by the teeth that chew the food into smaller pieces, and also chemical digestion from the saliva, which contains an enzyme called amylase. You know it's an enzyme if the name ends in ASE, A-S-E. So amylase, the enzyme, digests complicated carbohydrates called starch into their component units, which are, in this case, disaccharides. So that means 2 sugars joined together. This diagram shows you the layout of human teeth. This will become more important when we go on to Unit 4 next year with evolution of humans, because the layout of the teeth has varied quite significantly during human evolution, along with the size and shape of the jaw. So in the mouth, the mechanical digestion is partly the chewing by the teeth, also known as mastication, followed by bolus formation by the tongue. So this is where the food is formed into small balls of food, which are then swallowed. This is helped by the tongue, which is actually a very large muscle. Here's another slide of human teeth. So the incisors at the front, the canines on the corners, premolars and molars, which are more for grinding the food. There's also a side view of the jaw. This view shows you the roots of the teeth as well. So the molars are quite big, some of them with 2 roots, along with a cross-section of 1 single tooth. The mouth contains 3 pairs of salivary glands. some above and some below the tongue. They all produce saliva, which has various components, but the most important for you is the amylase, which is a digestive enzyme for starch. Once it leaves the mouth, food goes down through the pharynx, which has a little flap at the top called the epiglottis, which then closes down over the trachea, which is where the air goes into the lungs, and this prevents food going in there and choking. So the tongue and the soft palate, which is at the top of the mouth, push the food back, close off the trachea when you swallow, and then you pass food through the pharynx or throat and into the next part of the alimentary canal, which is the esophagus. Your food doesn't need gravity to fall down to your stomach. So how does it go down? There are two types of muscles in your esophagus. One type of muscle are like a ring, and the other ones are longitudinal, so up and down. This results in a movement known as peristalsis, which is a wave-like contraction of these smooth involuntary muscles, pushing food down towards the stomach. This is a diagram to show the cross-section of the esophagus. This isn't in your syllabus, so you don't need to know this diagram. This diagram shows you these wave-like actions known as peristalsis, which push the food down to the top of the stomach. The top of the stomach is controlled by a sphincter. A sphincter is another name for a circular muscle. So it's under control, but involuntary control, so it's not something that you think about. The sphincter at the top of the stomach is called the cardiac sphincter, and the sphincter at the bottom of the stomach, which keeps the food in the stomach, is called the pyloric sphincter. The stomach itself has three main functions. So it mixes and stores the food until it can be further digested. So food stays in the stomach on average for between 2 and 8 hours. The stomach also secretes chemicals that help break the food into more digestible forms. I'll talk in a little bit of detail about those in a couple of slides' time. It also controls the passage of food, so the movement of food, into the small intestine. So the cardiac sphincter is at the top of the stomach, the pyloric sphincter is at the bottom. So within the stomach itself, there are muscular walls which also contract in waves to churn the food around. And there's also chemical digestion that happens in the stomach. So there are gastric glands and an enzyme called pepsin, which I'll talk about in more detail next. Here's a diagram of the stomach. Again, you don't need to know all of the names for these parts of the stomach, but what you should notice is that there are muscle layers in different directions which help the stomach walls move towards each other and in different directions to move the food around. I did want to mention in the walls of the stomach are gastric pits. So different cells in these gastric pits may produce different things that help in the digestion. So the cells at the top of the gastric pits produce a mucus. That mucus covers the lining and lines the stomach walls, which is really important because other cells produce a very concentrated acid. So these are called parietal cells. They produce hydrochloric acid, which helps in the digestion process in the stomach, but also would cause burns if it wasn't for the mucus that was produced. There's also some cells called chief cells, which make pepsinogen and also an enzyme that digests fats called lipase. So proteases, or protein digesting enzymes, are produced in the stomach. The way that they're produced is in an inactive form known as pepsinogen. It moves out of the gastric pits and then it's activated by the low pH in the stomach acid, becoming an active pepsin, and that begins the digestion of protein to peptides. So peptides are still several amino acids long, so it's not complete digestion into the subunits of amino acids. That happens in the small intestines, but it's the beginning of protein digestion. If it wasn't for the mucus, and if the pepsinogen was secreted in an active form, the stomach muscle itself could be digested. Following on from the stomach under the control of the pyloric sphincter, you get to the beginning of the small intestines. After I've talked a little bit about the small intestines, I'm going to talk about the accessory organs, so the gallbladder, the pancreas and the liver, although they all secrete digestive juices into the beginning of the small intestine. But I'll talk about them after I've talked about the small intestine itself. The small intestine has 3 distinct parts. So from the top, the duodenum, the jejunum and the ileum. Most of the chemical digestion takes place in the duodenum by the chemicals which are secreted by the liver, pancreas into the small intestine. The jejunum and the ileum absorb the molecules by way of little hair-like projections known as villi, and then those nutrients are passed directly into the bloodstream or the lymph. Peristalsis also occurs in the gut. This slide shows you a diagram of the small intestines showing the different parts. So if this would be the bottom of the stomach here, and then the first part would be the duodenum, continuing on into the jejunum, a bit like sausages, and then the final part would be the ileum. After the small intestines come the large intestines, which are mainly water absorption. Most of the absorption of nutrients happens in the small intestines. The ability to do quick absorption in the small intestines is largely thanks to these projections, hair-like projections, which are similar to the cilia in the respiratory tract, but they have a slightly different structure. And what you can notice is that this capillary bed projects up into the villi, and also in the center there is a lacteal, which is part of the lymphatic system. The small intestines is also incredibly long, so 6 meters, and the inner lining is a mucosa, so that means a mucus covered layer. Villi extend from the folded surface of the mucosa, and microvilli extend from the outside of the villi, so the surface area for absorption for each person is about the size of a tennis court. Here's another diagram of one of the microvilli on a villi. So absorption in the small intestines can occur via diffusion or active transport depending on what the nutrient is. So the diffusion is nutrient moves from a high concentration to a lower concentration. And active transport is when the cells of the villi use energy to take in nutrients against the concentration gradient. And this is a light microscope image of some villi in the intestine. a labeled diagram this time. Maybe one too many diagrams. So now I wanted to talk about some of the accessory organs which secrete their specific juices into the beginning of the small intestine, so where the duodenum is. So the focus on the digestive system is the pancreas, which is the frilly yellow shaped organ shown there. Also the liver and the gallbladder. So the gallbladder stores bile which is secreted from the liver. So the pancreas has 3 important functions. It produces enzymes which help break down proteins, lipids and carbohydrates. It also produces the hormone insulin, which helps regulate blood glucose levels. You'll learn about that in a lot more detail in Unit 3 next year. The third function is that it produces sodium bicarbonate, which helps to neutralize the stomach acids. So this slide details the chemical digestion that is helped by the pancreas in the pancreatic juice. So there's amylase, which digests starch into disaccharides. There's also a pancreatic protease, which digests proteins into peptides and polypeptides. There's also lipases, which digest lipids into their units of fatty acids and glycerol. And there's also nucleases to digest DNA and RNA. So the liver carries out mechanical digestion. I'll explain why it's classed mechanical digestion in a moment. So the liver produces something called bile. Although the liver produces it, it stores it in an adjacent organ known as the gallbladder. That stores it, concentrates and releases it. It's then secreted into the top of the small intestines, that's the duodenum. So the bile salts emulsify lipids. So it's considered mechanical because it isn't an enzyme. It just emulsifies the fats, increasing the surface area. So emulsification makes it into lots of tiny droplets because lipids are not soluble in water and they tend to clump together. This diagram shows you a layout of the stomach, the pancreas and the liver. This shows you the same as a diagram, but it also shows the location of the gallbladder and there's labels. So in this case, the pancreas is shown behind the stomach. This slide shows you the major functions of the liver. So it deaminates amino acids, so that means removes the nitrogen. It converts glucose to glycogen. Glycogen is a long chain glucose molecule which stores glucose in the liver for kind of medium term energy release. It also produces the bile, which is stored in the gallbladder. It stores iron, several vitamins, and it also synthesizes vitamin A and plasma proteins. And another main function of the liver is to detoxify drugs, which can include alcohol and other toxic substances. So a quick summary of chemical digestion, which is the breaking down of nutrients into simpler organic compounds. So remember, digestive processes can be chemical, involving digestive enzymes, or mechanical. So the enzyme amylase acts on carbohydrates, and the end product are simple sugars like glucose. Glucose isn't the only sugar. Lipase, the enzyme that acts on lipids or fats, it makes fatty acids and glycerol. Protease acts on proteins to make their subunits of amino acids. So chemical digestion in the mouth is caused by salivary amylase, which turns the polysaccharides like starch into sugars. Chemical digestion in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid activates pepsinogen, making it into pepsin, which then starts the digestion of proteins. There's limited absorption in the stomach, but there's some absorption of water, glucose, alcohol, and some drugs. Much of the chemical digestion happens in the duodenum. So you have amylases, which do the final step of digestion of disaccharides or two sugar molecules into single sugars like glucose. The fats and oils are digested into fatty acids and glycerol, helped by the emulsification of the bile. And then trypsin is another protease. So mechanical processes in the duodenum are that bile salts emulsify the fats or reduce them to small droplets. And further chemical digestion in the small intestine. So maltose goes to glucose. Lactose goes to glucose. Sucrose goes to glucose. And again, lipase and peptidases for the lipids and proteins. So lots of absorption takes place in the small intestines of these simple sugars like glucose. The subunits of proteins, amino acids, water and minerals are absorbed into the blood capillaries. The fatty acids and glycerol are also absorbed into the lacteals, causing something called chyle. There's also in the stomach contents are called chyme. After the small intestines comes the large intestines. So this starts with an area called the cecum. This is actually enlarged in horses, and this is where a lot of their digestion of grass happens in horses. There's also this little appendage called the appendix, which is used for digestion in some other species, but less so in humans. After the cecum, you come to the colon. So there's different branches of the colon. The names are fairly obvious, so ascending going up, transverse across, descending going down to the rectum, where all of the waste with all of the water that's been removed comes out as poo. So the final couple of slides are about the functions of the large intestines. So the large intestines come after the small intestines. So their main job are further absorption of water and some salts. But another thing that's very important in the large intestines are bacterial activity. So there are trillions of resident bacteria, and they're believed to have several important roles. In addition to digesting cellulose in plant foods, also known as fiber, and making some vitamins which can't be made in the human body.